Now that we are celebrating 75 years of the Indian Constitution, if we ask ourselves, has the constitutional morality become a natural sentiment in India? I would say that it is no. The answer is no. It has not yet become a natural sentiment in India. But how long are we going to have the inequalities in our socio-economic life? The caste system and caste-based discriminations haven't vanished. In private places, it still continues in some way. Caste is an important identity in India. There was this very first article which says, all human beings are born free and equal. The initial draft, it seems, said all men are born free and equal. It was Hans Mehta who persuaded them to change this. Women were no doubt inadequately represented in the Constituent Assembly. Out of 299, there were only 50 women. That's roughly 5%. It is not even a reasonable representation, so to say, forget about adequate representation. They played an important role, no doubt, in the making of the Indian Constitution. We always keep referring to founding fathers, but don't refer to founding mothers.
Welcome to Postcards, your passport to unseen corners of people, policy, and politics. I'm your host, Nikunj, and today we're talking about a very, very fascinating topic. It's the Constitution. However, the episode is titled People's Constitution. Now, when we think about Constitution is not something that is just discussed and debated in a courtroom, in the halls of policy makers, or even in schools, particularly law schools. It is also experienced, discussed, debated in chai tapris, in everyday offices, in municipality offices, in post offices, and so many other spaces that we can't even imagine, which really talks about what is Constitution, who is it truly for, how is it lived and experienced by everyone in a country, and is Constitution an evolving piece of work or not? It also talks about who gets access, who gets excluded, who gets further marginalized, and who and what is being enshrined in an everyday life. And so therefore, we're talking about rights as paperwork, dignity as procedure, and freedom as something that may often depend on something very tiny administrative decision, but can have such a huge ripple effect. I'm so delighted and thrilled and also grateful to have Dr. Puneet with us today talking about this brilliant topic. Of course, Dr. Puneet right now works as Professor of Law at the Center for Study of Law and Governance at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and his work spans constitutional law, judicial processes, criminal law, relationship between individual freedoms and national security. And Dr. Puneet, you have written in quite a few spaces online as well, ranging from The Wire and Outlook and like quite a few, I would say, magazines that way as well.
Very few, not much in the public.
Okay, very few.
Yeah.
But I would still...
Compared to what I should have actually written. But I'm increasingly plan to write more and more in these media platforms.
Of course. I think I have this starting question that's not related to Constitution. Why are so many academics like yourself so self-critical? Like you started by saying, I should be doing more. I haven't done as much. Where does that self-critique comes from?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me on your show. We always have this feeling that we could have done more than what we are doing, actually. We prioritize, generally, there is also a compulsion to write on what gives more, what we now call as APA points. Writing in journals, writing books, or writing edited chapters in edited books and all that. and generally writing for the newspapers, writing for the other web based platforms, that doesn't give us so much of academic credits, and we don't prioritize as much unless there is some issue that comes up which forces us to think and write something on. So that's when, that's what I said. I've written very few articles there. I've written more for the journals and other edited books and all that.
Yeah. But you would like to write more. What kind of stuff would you like to write more for the newspaper articles or any kind of advocacy that you would like?
In the sense that I don't think in advance about what should I be writing about. Whenever some issue crop up, and if it prompts me enough to write something, I do that.
Okay.
Now, in fact, I'm currently writing about the new suggestions that are made about connecting rights with duties, and then saying, unless you perform your duties, you don't get your right. I'm about to finalize a short piece on that, and then critiquing that very understanding of the right. So it's when generally we keep following, because I focus more on constitutional law. I focus more on what the judiciary is doing with the constitution. As and when there is some issue that crops up, and if is important enough, and if I find time to immediately write a piece, because it also so happens that if you don't immediately write, newspapers are not interested in taking it up. So it all depends on that.
Right. And we'll definitely come back to discussing a little bit about rights and duties as well in a bit. But I actually want to start by talking to you, and I'm thinking of, which is hard to imagine at this stage, but as a kid growing up, and you mentioned in Karnataka. So you grew up in Karnataka, you're growing up. When you imagine yourself as a kid now, when did your love, for law, constitution started, or were there like series of moments? How did you really thought about constitution at that time, or experience it in any way?
I don't know. If I recollect, it's very hard to say when exactly my attention was drawn towards the constitution. I did my schooling in my native village in Karnataka up to 7th standard. And there in my village and in the neighboring villages, the Ambedkar's birth anniversary was celebrated in a big way. And that's when programs are being held. People were invited to deliver speeches. And as a kid, I was always curious. You go and attend all kinds of speeches. So that's when we started learning about there's something called a constitution that exists. And of course, in our schools too, the Republic Day, celebrated. And we used to all participate in the processions followed by speeches. So that's the reason for us to, have, some understanding of what this constitution all about. It's all we learned through that, about something, not much about. There's something called a constitution that gives us rights and all that. And we had, of course, civics papers in schools and all that, where you write, all that I recollect is about, I read about some rights. Nothing more than that. But I don't know for what reason, there is not one as such, but I decided very early on in life that I should be doing a LLB, law, particularly a 5-year law immediately after my +2. I decided about it almost firmly when I was actually in 9th standard. So it had happened, and then particularly what increased our interest in constitution is because in the late 1990s, there was this discussion also about changing the constitution. If you know, there was this constitution was about to complete almost 50 years, in 2000. So late 1990s, there was this discussion about, changing the constitution, because it stands in the way of progress of the country. There is a lot that needs to be reformed and all all these discussions has created lots of curiosity about what this constitution is all about. So I've had that curiosity from the beginning about learning more about the constitution.
Wow. So that's quite a journey, I would say, already that you were on. And I think you brought something very interesting. It's like a Republic Day, which is very soon actually, or even Independence Day at times. Like it is these moments when you like really think about, it kind of comes to the fore and you're thinking about it. And you're experiencing it as well in many ways. And so when you think of a child or a kid in a school, and if you have to define to a 7-year-old, what is a constitution and why is it important? If you think it's important, how would you, share that with them?
Yeah, it is very difficult to simplify the constitution as such. The constitution is a foundational document of our republic. It is, according to the constitution, our body politic is constituted and governed. It establishes the major institutions for the governance, like the legislature, executive, and the judiciary, both at the center and the state levels. And it also provides for establishment of various auxiliary institutions too, like the Controller and Auditor General of India, like the Public Service Commissions, like the election commissions, which are all very important in the governance of the country. What it does is it organizes power by vesting, divesting, diffusing, sometimes limiting the power in the sense of conferring rights on people, which are essentially limitations on the state power. And it also lays the blueprint for the progress, what path the country should take. In future, the Constitution of India contains blueprint. So it is in that way not just a contrivance for establishing institutions of governance and conferring on them power. The Constitution of India is a much ambitious project. It has a larger goal, much larger goal of transforming the country, not just its polity, but also the society and the economy. It is, in a way, a very foundational document which has all these. And this country is governed according to the Constitution. It has all the essential framework and the principles that should direct the way the governance is to be carried on in the country.
I think what's very fascinating is what you were talking about, that there are these folks who are sitting together and having all these debates about the future of the country. And this is happening all before 1950. So in my mind, oh my God, more than 75 years at this stage. Yeah. And you're deciding what this young nation that is coming up is going to look like. There's an idea of nation building. It's a very, very diverse country which has experienced a lot of violence up until recently. It is coming out from its colonial past and trying to find its place in the larger world. And so when I think about it, and when these folks are huddled, I don't know if it's a table, if it's a larger room, of course it's multiple spaces, not just one, right? Including the parliament.
Yeah.
These key members who are having these discussions, what kind of debates are they having? What kind of discussions are they having when they're trying to give shape to the Constitution?
Constitution that we have today is a product of extensive debates. As almost everyone know now, that it took almost 3 years, to be precise, 2 years, 11 months and 13 days for drafting of the Constitution. And it was discussed extensively in the Constituent Assembly. And what is important for us to note is that the Constituent Assembly is not the only place where the Constitution was discussed. It was discussed outside as well. It was discussed in many public forums. The draft Constitution was put in public domain for about 8 months. Many seminars, conferences, it was discussed. It was discussed in many of the provincial assemblies too. And it was discussed in the Assembly Party, Congress Assembly Party, as Granville Austin says. What we have today, which is accessible, is the debates that are held in the Constituent Assembly. That itself is very enriching.
Right.
It is often said that the debates in the Constituent Assembly sets the highest benchmark of public discourse in the country. Never before in the past and not after there was such a discussion that was held on any of the issues that concern the nation. So it has been discussed very extensively, though Constituent Assembly consisted of a majority of members from one political party, the Congress, that the Assembly has had people with all new thoughts. Nobody was prevented from expressing their views and opinions. Even among the members of the Congress, there were divergent opinions too. And then many others were also there in the Constituent Assembly who spoke extensively about various provisions of the Constitution. And of course, in the process, many compromises were made. And many special provisions are made to get all the states along. So it is, in fact, a product of extensive discussions and deliberations that were held. And I always find the debates in the Constituent Assembly very exciting to read. You know, it's very well documented, unlike the debates that are held in the Philadelphia Convention at the time of the making of the American Constitution. We don't find the official transcription of those debates. But the best thing is that we have everything that was uttered in the Constituent Assembly, including the jokes that were made, documented in the Constituent Assembly debates. So that shows that the amount of care and caution that was taken at the time of the making of the Constitution. Often people have this tendency of saying that the Constitution of India is a photocopy of the Government of India Act and various other constitutions in the world, which in my opinion is not the correct understanding of the Constitution. I don't think they had to spend so much time deliberating in the Assembly and outside the Assembly and so many aspects of it if the work was only to copy-paste from the other sources. It is a product of extensive deliberations. There are some of the provisions which are debated for a very long time. Sometimes even the choice of words were debated. So it is very carefully crafted document taking into account the living realities. There is this Israeli jurist called Eran Barak who says every constitution reflects the past, lays foundation for the present, and seeks to shape the future. And that's what the Indian Constitution actually does. Framers were very much aware of the living realities of the day, and they had a vision for transforming it. So every aspect of it is discussed very extensively. It's in fact always very exciting for me to go back to the Constituent Assembly debates and see how different provisions were discussed.
And that sounds very fascinating. So, so can you give us an example of any debates that come to your mind, which were either surprising to your mind right now, or we were discussing something like this, and maybe another debate that comes to your mind, which was heavily debated. Like, the consensus on that was very, very tough to achieve because the folks across the spectrum had very, very diverse opinions.
I think one of the highly contested aspect is the language policy. It was like a very important one. There were very extensive discussions, fierce disagreements, and compromises were struck. And then even when it comes to the fundamental rights, of course, there was never a discussion on whether fundamental rights should be part of the Constitution or not. There was a overwhelming consensus that was built during the India's independence struggle itself, but about certain specific aspects of it. Say, for example, right to religion, where Constitution says right to profess, practice, and propagate religion. Almost everybody seems to have agreed with profess and practice, but some people have had problems with propagation of religion, saying, why should in a country where majority are Hindus, which is a non-proselytizing religion, propagation should be guaranteed as a fundamental right? And they were told that this was the promise that we have made, and we can't go back on the promise, and it needs to be conferred. And similarly, the choice between procedure established by law and the due process of law. Due process of law is an American concept. It's part of the American constitutional jurisprudence, which has been developed over a period to provide protection to the life and liberty of the people, and also to property. Life, liberty, and property can't be taken away except according to due process of law. And due process of law is not just set forth as a concept that is developed over a period of time, which accords far more greater protection to the life, liberty, and property. Somehow it was felt, based on the advice of the constitutional advisor B.N. Rao, who consulted Felix Frankfurter of the US, who was the former US Supreme Court judge, said, if you have a due process protection, judiciary will interfere far too much into state affairs. So that's when he said we should drop due process and have procedure established by law class into the Constitution. And that has also witnessed lots of discussions and disagreements in the Constituent Assembly. And finally, we dropped due process and adopted the procedure established by law class. But over a period, Indian Supreme Court brought back the due process through interpretive process.
It's very interesting you use the word interpretive, and I know you meant it technically, but there's a lot of interpretation of the Constitution which constantly happens. And it's not just being done by the courts, but it's also being done by the people themselves.
Yes.
In so many ways.
Yes.
When you think, and again, if we go back in 1950, now the Constitution is out, and people are experiencing it in different ways. And there is this book that I really like. It's by Rohit Dey. It's literally called People's Constitution.
People's Constitution. Yeah.
And he realized that the Constitution was not just a legal document, but something ordinary Indians started engaging in their everyday lives, at least some Indians. So they're testing its promises and using it to challenge local authority or assert rights and claim new freedoms. I was wondering if you have any thoughts or any examples that come to your mind. How did, in a newly independent India, which is now Republic of India with a constitution, how our people started to use, or maybe use a stronger term, but how are people starting to think about constitution? You have a document, it has been debated in so many places, but what is changing for a person and how are they thinking about it?
Yeah, I think Rohit Dey captures it very well in his book. As I had mentioned before, people were very much aware and many were keen to follow the process of constitution making. And there is another book by Rohit Dey, which is recently also released, on assembling India's constitution, where he talks about people's participation in the constitution making. Otherwise, our general understanding is that it's the elites who participated in the constitution making process, and people have had no voice, though they participated massively in the India's independence movement, struggle. But their participation in the making of the constitution is very less. But Rohit Dey's book, Rohit Dey and Ornisani, It is a book recently published in the 2025. Disproves it. It says that the people were there are letters being written to the Constituent Assembly from different places in India, and all kinds of people, tribals, people from unorganized sector, telling the constitution makers as to what they expect from it and how they should address some of the concerns that they have. So there was this awareness about the constitution even at the time of its making. And when the constitution was made, it was brought into force, people have started using it. It's not just the elites, even the ordinary people have started using it. That's what Rohit Day's book, People's Constitution, talk about. One another instance that I would particularly recollect is about even after the independence, there were a lot of people who are preventively detained in the country. And the Constitution, no doubt, sanctions preventive detention with certain safeguards now, which is safeguards are part of the fundamental rights. But the moment the Constitution was brought into force, there were hundreds of people who were preventively detained who approached the court that the law under which they were earlier detained is not in conformity with the Constitution. Hundreds of people, in West Bengal and in many other parts of the country. And that's when they realized for some reason that the detentions under the existing law cannot be, because existing laws are not in conformity with the Constitution, can't be justified. They have enacted the Preventive Detention Act almost within months after the adoption of the Constitution too. It is because otherwise they would have gone to the court and the court would have definitely granted relief. And it was, if you look at the history of enactment of the Preventive Detention Act, it was introduced, debated, passed, President assent was given, all on the same day, which was a Sunday. Because the next day, as some of the literature points out, there were hundreds of petitions which are slated to be heard on the following day, and all of them would have been released. So people from the beginning have started using the Constitution, started asserting their rights under the Constitution, and they've gone to courts challenging several state actions. That's really very interesting for us to note that in the formative years, so many people have thought of using the Constitution and asserting their rights against the state actions.
Wow. I think I truly didn't, before this actually imagine the scale at which all of this is happening as well, and how so many people are asserting their rights as well. I'm also wondering that while the constitution making is happening, were there any, during different discussions or the letters that are coming in and everything that's happening, was there any anxieties that were also kind of getting surfaced around the direction in which the constitution is getting, towards which it is getting shaped, or the kind of things we're introducing into it, and those kind of anxieties or the outcomes of those anxieties in some ways that is kind of still lingering in the year 2026?
Yeah, there were, of course, lots of anxieties. Some are expressed in the Constituent Assembly itself. And there were, in fact, the people with the conservative viewpoints as well. They did not want so much of transformation to take place. And along with framing of the Constitution, Constituent Assembly was also acting as an interim parliament at that point in time. Even reforms in Hindu Code Bill was also under consideration at that point in time. All of them have created a lot of anxieties. Of course, there were many who are very clear in their mind that the Indian society needs to be transformed. And they pushed through all these changes. And there was also momentum, that to create a country which would become one. So all concerns that needs to be addressed and all injustices needs to be remedied, historical injustices. So they went ahead, and there was such a momentum that the overwhelming majority stood by the decisions that some of the forward-looking leaders in the Constituent Assembly were proposing. The anxieties were no doubt there, and they are still there in some form or the other. It is not that people in India say, all have accepted the Constitution completely and it has become a living reality. That's not the case. There are so many aspects of the Constitution which still remain in text and not yet been translated into living realities.
Yeah.
And even today we see so many opposition to some of the reforms that was contemplated in the Constitution way back in 1950s. So some of them still linger on.
And can you give an example of an anxiety, for example, that was really there at that time and which is still there in some ways right now?
Even if you look at, say, for example, the language issue.
Language.
Is one of the important ones. As and when there are talks about the one language, there are oppositions that come from several states, and it is a matter of serious concern even today, and people don't take lightly these kind of issues. It's one of the very delicate issues. Language is it's for various reasons has become a bone of contention. It was then, and it is still now.
Yeah.
One of the controversial issues to be discussed.
Yeah. And we were all sorry.
No, similarly, if you look at the reforms in personal law, that's also one of the very controversial issues. It was there then. They put a provision in the Directive Principles of State Policy, thinking that someday we can move towards a uniform civil code. And it is still a very contentious issue.
Yeah. So what I'm also hearing a lot is, I think, identity, and of course being very diverse with like so many different identities, I think there were like anxieties around that. Of course, we've touched upon the language itself. I think you touched a little bit briefly around the religion as well when we're talking about UCC, but also around caste, around gender, around our tribal, like someone's tribal identity, and other things would have also had certain anxieties. Of course, there were things like affirmative action that was introduced in some ways, but when we think of the debates again that are happening at that time, what really surfaces around all these identities and trying to create a world, or India specifically in this case, which is more equal, because that is one of the founding principles that we have as well.
Yeah. We always keep saying about this unity in diversity. Constitution did not intend to erase identities altogether, but it certainly intended to erase the practice of discriminations based on identities. It's a very diverse country. There are identities that are based on several, even each individual has multiple identities. They have their caste, they have their religion, they have their language. All that are very important issues. But the Constitution, one clear objective was to eliminate identity-based discriminations, to establish a more egalitarian society. Identities are fine, but identities-based hierarchies should not be created, and no discrimination based on that identities. That's what the Constitution framework did. It's not about erasing all kinds of identities. Our unity is because we respect our diversity. the moment you disrespect diversity and try and create artificially that oneness to eliminate every other differences, probably it might have implications on our unity as well.
Yeah.
That's why framers were very careful. What they want to address was the adverse consequences of the identity-based discriminations.
Yep.
And that's what precisely they intend to address.
Yeah. And of course, Dr. Ambedkar played such a huge role in the making of the Constitution itself, very active in terms of the kind of principles that were brought in. So how do you see Dr. Ambedkar print essentially on the larger Constitution, and what are some of the things he really pushed for, which are still the core principles that is governing our society in a very positive light?
Constitution is a product of the Constituent Assembly, where many have contributed for making of the Constitution. Ambedkar, no doubt, played a very key role in making of the Constitution, though he struggled to get into the Constituent Assembly in the beginning. Probably you may be knowing about how difficult it was for him to get into the Constituent Assembly.
So why was it difficult?
The Constituent Assembly was constituted based on the elections that were held to the provincial assemblies. The elections were held a few months before, and there was no direct election to the Constituent Assembly. They decided that we elect representatives from the provincial assemblies.
Right.
Ambedkar at that point in time had a party called the Scheduled Caste Federation, which did not have sufficient number in the Bombay Provincial Assembly to send him to the Constituent Assembly. He contested unsuccessfully and lost the election. And then one of his friend, Jogindernath Mandal, who's from West Bengal, who later became the first law minister in Pakistan, he had invited Ambedkar to contest election from West Bengal. And he forged an alliance with the Muslim League and got Ambedkar elected into the Constituent Assembly. Ambedkar went there, made some interventions. Then the partition happened. Even Bengal got divided into West Bengal and the East Bengal. As a result, Ambedkar lost his seat. Again, he went out of the Constituent Assembly. And later, with the support of the Congress, he got elected again from Maharashtra and came back to the Constituent Assembly. His journey into the Constituent Assembly itself is very illustrious. And as he said in one of the speeches, perhaps the last speech that he delivered, his purpose of entering into Constituent Assembly is to protect the interest of the scheduled caste and the vulnerable sections. But when he was asked to play a much larger role, he did play a much larger role. He was elected as a chairperson of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly. And he was also a member of some of the other committees, like Subcommittee on Fundamental Rights and all. And he played a very significant role in drafting the Constitution. It's Constitution drafting, so to say, started with effectively the moving of objective resolution by Nehru, and then several committees were appointed by the Constituent Assembly to on different subjects, and they all submitted report. Based on the reports that were submitted, the Constituent Assembly advisor, B.N. Rao, prepared a rough draft of the Constitution, which was given to the drafting committee to work. And the drafting committee reworked, redrafted, and presented the Constitution to the Constituent Assembly. And Ambedkar played a very key role. That's what T.T. Krishnamachari also says, that of all the people in the drafting committee, Ambedkar played a big role in drafting of the Constitution. But his role did not end there. Perhaps he played a much important role in the Assembly in defending the draft Constitution. And, there was this vital statistics by PRS, which I looked at a few years back, which says Ambedkar is the one who spoke the maximum number of words in the Constituent Assembly, 267,000 plus words.
Oh, wow.
The second highest number of words was spoken by H.V. Kamath, which was 180,000 plus words. So he extensively contributed for the debates in the Constituent Assembly. He has explained the reasons as to the constitutional choices were made, particular constitutional choices were made, and defended them wherever he thought that the people who held a contrary view had a better reason. Some of their points were accepted, the constitution amendments were allowed, and in the course they were also, looking at what people think about the draft constitution. Some of the changes the drafting committee itself has introduced in the Constituent Assembly based on what was happening outside, what were the demands that the people are placing and all that. So if there is one person who has played a major role, of course, he's not the only one who single-handedly drafted the constitution, but Ambedkar certainly played a very major role in drafting of the India's constitution.
And this may be a tough one to answer, but what do you think Dr. Ambedkar felt about the final piece of work, which is a result of, like you said, huge discussions, debates, not just in the Constitutional Assembly, but otherwise as well. And of course, it's a negotiation at the end of the day.
Yeah, it is.
At the end of the day, not everyone is going to be happy with everything that's there in the document itself. So how did he feel as not the only one, but one of the major architects of this foundational work for our country? Do you remember any quotes, any things that he said afterwards or in hindsight that kind of shed light on how he felt about the Constitution?
He had his own anxieties, if one looks at his final speech, virtually Ambedkar was given an opportunity to have a final word in the Constituent Assembly too. Of the major speeches, there were of course some speeches delivered after too. He delivers his final speech on 25th of November 1949. That is a day before the adoption of the Constitution, where he expresses his apprehension very clearly. About the what can actually lead us in a different way, and what should be the path that the leaders should take, what should be the path that the people should take, and all that. So it is not that, he even has said that howsoever good the Constitution may be, it can fail if the people working it are not good, because Constitution is not going to work on its own. It has to be worked, you can change the Constitution even when you keep its form. That's what Ambedkar also says about. So he had his own apprehension, not that the Constitution now that we have put in place with all, consultations, discussions and debates at it, and it is one of the robust constitutions, and we need not have to worry any further. That was not the view that Ambedkar had. He had his own share of apprehensions. And some of them are still ringing. If you look at, I generally suggest everyone to read at least his last speech that he delivered on 25th November 1949 to understand, which is still very relevant. It resonates with all of us even today.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned that he had certain anxieties and which linger even today in some ways. And we only need to look at, for example, some of the discrimination that still persists in the modern India. And so even if something is written in a document, the practice of it is a whole different thing altogether.
And he had this apprehension, when he was talking about why Constitution is so bulky and so much of details and all that. He said, citing Grote, that the constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment in India. Democracy is a top dressing on an Indian soil. So now that we are celebrating 75 years of the Indian Constitution, if we ask ourselves, has the constitutional morality become a natural sentiment in India? I would say that it is no.
Okay.
The answer is no. It has not yet become a natural sentiment in India. yeah, I don't know, it might take time. But in my opinion, I think we should inculcate the constitutional values from the very beginning. And we should strive to promote the constitutional values as much as possible. Otherwise, that's what he talks about, his apprehension about from 26th of January 1915. There will be equality on political plane, that there will be one man, one vote, one value. But how long are we going to have the inequalities in our socio-economic life? The caste system and caste-based discriminations haven't vanished. Of course, caste-based discriminations are prohibited in public places. In private places, it still continues in some way. Caste is an important identity in India, and the caste-based discriminations are rampant. When we read about an IPS officer belonging to the scheduled caste community can't go on a horse during his wedding without a police protection, I think that's a clear indication that the caste still persists. And when there are resistance for entry of women into temples, there are discriminations that still exist, which are not in conformity with the constitutional ideas and values at all. So he says, how long are we going to live this life of contradiction, where you have equality on one plane and inequalities in our socio-economic life? If it continues for too long, then probably the people who are adversely affected are likely to blow up the whole system we are so laboriously. That's one of his final warnings on his 25th November 1949 speech. So, but if you look at, I was looking at some of the statistics on economic inequality. There is this article by Thomas Piketty and others on Rise of Billionaire Raj in India, where they talk about, how both inequality in income and wealth is more now than what it was in 1947, 1950. The constitutional idea was to reduce inequalities in income and wealth. But are we working towards that? Perhaps we are working in an opposite direction. It seems, at least if you look at all this, even that the whole article is based on the government data. They say inequality both in income and wealth is growing year after year. And it was like from 1950 to 1980s or so, there was some reduction. But from 1980 onwards, it was increasing drastically after liberalization, privatization, globalization policy that we have adopted. India is creating more and more billionaires, at the same time pushing more and more people into below poverty line. The gap between the rich and the poor is growing, which indicate that we are perhaps not on the constitutional path.
I think you touched on some very important points. Before that, I think you also mentioned about the last speech that Dr. Ambedkar made, which you recommended everyone should read. And what we'll do is we'll put it in our show notes for this episode, which is on Postcards 101 page that everyone can kind of check out. We also talked about the women, right? And earlier you were mentioning how Constituent Assembly was initially created to kind of have representatives of the people. And so in many ways, the Constituent Assembly itself was predominantly male. There were some women who played a key role, women like Hansa Mehta, Dakshayani Velayudhan, and Rajkumari Ambedkar. So when you think of women in the Constituent Assembly, who comes to your mind and what kind of role that they have played for gender rights, equality, and even social justice?
Women were no doubt inadequately represented in the Constituent Assembly. Out of 299, there were only 15 women. That's roughly 5%. It is not even a reasonable representation, so to say, forget about adequate representation. And they played an important role, no doubt, in the making of the Indian Constitution. We always keep referring to founding fathers, but don't refer to founding mothers. Though, there is this vital statistics that I was looking at about who spoke what. There were 9 members or so who spoke, 9 or 6, I forgot, who spoke more than 1 lakh words in the Constituent Assembly. Unfortunately, none of these 15 are part of this, the group who spoke more than 1 lakh words. But they have made some significant interventions in the Constituent Assembly and some of the important aspects, not just on issues concerning the gender and equality. They did, no doubt, but also on other aspects. Like I remember when I was looking at Constituent Assembly debates on preventive detentions, Durga Bai was one of the prominent female voices who vehemently defended the extraordinary provision like preventive detention, that the country like India needs it, and particularly under the circumstances in which the Constitution was being drafted. There was partition and all kinds of violence that was happening in the post-partition. That's the same time at which the Constitution was being drafted. Something like preventive detention was considered to be necessary. For members who defended, Durga Bai also vehemently defended. So they were not just focusing on issues concerning women, they were also thinking about the larger nation building as well. So the contributions are significant in that way.
And I was also wondering, you said 15, right?
15.
1, 5, 15, and which is, of course, pretty low number.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking intersectionally, out of these 15 women, how many women were Dalit women? How many women were Muslim women? How many women were Christian? How many women were Pahari women, from the islands? Again, from different parts, tribal women, for example.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the numbers are even.
Yeah, I know. I was recently reading this. I've not read it completely. I was flipping through this book on this, the 15. It's called the 15.
The 15.
15 women. And it says that out of 15, 13 would all belong to elite family. Some belongs to the royal family. Some are political elites and all that. Only 2, Dakshayani Velayudhan, she's one of the women from the downtrodden Dalit women. She was the only Dalit woman perhaps in the Constituent Assembly. And there is one more who come from a very humble background. But all other women, Sarojini Naidu, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, Hans Mehta, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, they all belong to the elite family in that way. And of course, Hans Mehta has also played a key role in drafting of the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm not sure whether you heard about it. They were simultaneously being drafted. We are drafting Indian Constitution here, and there was a UDHR being drafted under the chairpersonship of the Eleanor Roosevelt, and Hans Mehta was also part of it. There was this very first article which says, all human beings are born free and equal. The initial draft, it seems, said all men are born free and equal. It was Hans Mehta who persuaded them to change this, to convert all men into all human beings. Yeah. So she played a key role in the UDHR drafting as well.
Yeah, and which talks about how you're expanding the definition, constantly focusing on the words themselves, because right now the words carry so much meaning in interpretation. And I think, like you said, out of these 15, just 2, maybe not from the privileged background, and I'm sure that's true for the larger assembly as well. When you look at the men, for example, in the group, I'm not even sure about non-binary individuals. I was recently traveling, and I met someone from New Zealand during traveling. And I was surprised to learn that New Zealand doesn't have a constitution as such. And there are countries like New Zealand, there are countries like UK, Israel, who don't really have a constitution. Of course, there are few and far in between, but there are a few countries which don't have that. So when I was thinking about the countries and I was having a discussion with them, the question was largely about they don't have something similar to what we have in India and in some other parts of the world. So, or they may have a small text which becomes like a foundational text or which is giving some indication, but it's not necessarily like a constitution kind of a document as well. So my question therefore, and I was asking him as well, how do you think constitution is an important document? Is constitution making and building itself is an important document, constantly working on it, while there are countries which don't have it? And when I asked him, he said, yeah, we are doing fairly well in New Zealand without a constitution as well.
Yeah. There was this joke, I don't know whether it's apocryphal or real, that I heard about there's someone called Frank Zappa, American musician and a singer, also a political activist, who once said that what is that a country should mandatorily have? He seems to have said to be a true country, it must have a football team, a national airline, and a national beer.
Okay.
He did not mention about the constitution.
Yeah, so fascinating. So we're talking about football, but I'm assuming he meant American football because it's US. And we're talking about national beer. I don't know if you have a national beer in India per se. I don't know what it would be. And the third thing was national airline.
Yeah.
I guess Air India is an obvious contender, but again, like not all airlines are privatized. So I don't know. We have a government national airline per se.
So I don't know in what sense he said it. I assume it's all said it on a lighter note. But the idea that a country must mandatorily have a constitution was accepted or perhaps emerged only in the Second World War era, when more and more there were very few countries which have had written consolidated constitutions before. But in the post-World War era, more and more countries, the erstwhile colonies, when they become independent, the first major thing they did was to enact a constitution and adopt the constitutions of their own. So now more and more countries have constitutions. Of course, some claim that they have an unwritten constitution, like UK, which are based on conventions, constitutional conventions. And some part of it is now written. If you look at the Constitution Reforms Act of 2005 in UK and all, that's a written part of their constitution now. Increasingly, there also seems that realizing the importance of writing it down and putting it on places. And some of the countries have written constitutions but not consolidated. Like the Canada and Australia, they have a series of constitutional documents. It's not like one piece, which is called a constitution, like the Constitution of India or the Constitution of the United States of America. So there are written and unwritten constitutions. Unwritten is basically constitutional conventions that are there. And there are consolidated constitutions, and there are written but not consolidated constitutions. So it's not like they're all uniform in some way. And we say American Constitution is the oldest written constitution, and it is also the shortest constitution in the world. But in America, each of the state has a separate constitution of their own. In fact, there are 51 constitutions in America. Each of the 50 states have a constitution, and then there is a federal constitution of the United States of America. And I recently read that the Constitution of the state of Alabama is much larger than the Constitution of India, with nearly 350,000 words or so. Our Constitution had roughly 117,000 words, and now about 145,000 words or so. But their Constitution is almost twice the size of the Constitution of India, the Constitution of the state of Alabama, which has also seen nearly about 950 amendments or so in the state of Alabama. So we often don't look into these aspects. They say, they have a very short constitution which is working well. We have a very large constitution. Ambedkar explains why we had to have such a bulky constitution. It says it's of administrative details. He say, I wish there was no reason for incorporating these kind of administrative details into the Constitution. But he says, unfortunately, constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. Some of these details are very much required. So that is what made our Constitution bulkier than the other constitutions in the world. But it is unique in many ways. Our framers have had a profound understanding of a living reality and also a clear vision for transforming India. And that's how they laid down strong foundation for this constitution. And as many have suspected that whether it would survive for a long time, and it did survive. There was this study by Tom Ginsburg, which says that most constitutions don't survive for more than average lifespan of constitutions around the world is 17 years, 17.
Oh wow!
If you look at, and some don't even survive to see the second birth anniversary. And they claim that Ginsburg and the others make is that if the constitution survives for about 50 years, it gets entrenched. It's more likely to survive for longer. So ours has survived for 75 years. Sure, it has developed its roots deep, and it can withstand some of the storms and survive for longer.
I think that's very interesting. And I'm thinking now it's 1950. Now the Constitution is in place, right? How soon did we start amending the Constitution? Like we use the term amendment, right?
Yeah.
How soon did we start to amend it, and what was the reasoning behind it?
It's all started within months after the adoption of the Constitution. Before we even held a general election, first general election. There is this book by Tripur Daman Singh, and its title is, I think, 16 Stormy Days, the story of First Amendment. What made the First Amendment? First Amendment was made in response to judicial decisions. There were land reforms laws that are being enacted in several states. They were getting challenged and set aside by the courts, declared as unconstitutional because right to property was a fundamental right. And there were reservation policies, particularly in the state of Madras, which was set aside on the ground that it violates right to equality, reservation in education in particular. And there was no provision in the original constitution talking about reservation in education at that point in time. It only had provision apart from political reservation. It had only provisions relating to reservation in employment. There was no provision relating to reservation in education. And, though there was a provision in directive principles of state policy for promoting the educations of the weaker sections, they said, no, you can't violate fundamental rights to implement directive principles of state policy. They had to amend. And then there were some restrictions imposed on circulations of newspapers and all that, on the ground that the contents thereof has the potential to disturb public order. But public order was not one of the recognized grounds for restricting freedom of speech and expression. In two famous cases, Ramesh Thapa, so state of Madras, and Brijbhushan's case, the Supreme Court set aside the state actions. So they wanted to enable the state to restrict free speech even on the ground of public order and some of the other grounds. So it's all about, that in a way shows how quickly people in India have started using the Constitution in the courts of law to resist what they considered as unreasonable state actions. And the state at that particular point in time felt that it is necessary to enable the state. So our First Amendment was done to restrict the fundamental rights. Within few months they realized that we granted too much, and there has to be some more restrictions on the fundamental rights. And that's how the amendments have started being made. And it was even challenged that because there is a provision for amendment in the Constitution which says, like, it prescribes double majority, simple majority in both houses of the Parliament, and 2/3 majority of those who were present and voting for amending the constitution. But Constituent Assembly was a unilateral house. It did not have a bicameral legislature before the first general election. There was this challenge that how could they even amend the constitution? There are no two houses. But there is a provision in the transitory provisions which said that every power the parliament can exercise, in the meantime the Constituent Assembly can exercise. And that's how the Constituent Assembly itself amended the constitution within months after its adoption, and it was brought into force.
That's so fascinating on how you're already thinking for the next steps before the first general elections, which was 1952 itself. And you also talked about the courts, where they have started playing a crucial role as soon as the constitution is out. And one of the principles that courts use is called basic structure doctrine, to kind of preserve the constitutional boundaries. And I think recently it was during the electoral bonds judgment that when the courts looked at electoral bonds, and they passed a judgment looking at from a constitutional lens as well. So I was wondering if you can explain what is, first of all, basic structure doctrine, like you're explaining to a 7-year-old kid. How would you explain it, and how do you think the judgment around electoral bond speaks about how the courts look at democracy today, while looking from a lens of constitution, of course?
Basic structure doctrine came much later. It was not invented in 1950s. Basic structure doctrine came in 1973, almost 23 years after the adoption of the Constitution. It is about the amending power. The central question is about whether the power of the Parliament to amend the Constitution is unlimited, or are there any limitations on the amending power of the Constitution. Initially, the understanding was, even that's what the court also did, is that as long as they have the prescribed majority, which is a double majority that I mentioned, they can pretty much amend any part of the Constitution. And that's how the first case was decided. And there was a second case too, Sajjan Singh case, where there were some differences of opinion, of course, but the majority still said that the Parliament power to amend the Constitution is unlimited. They can amend any part of the Constitution. But then there was another case, Golaknath, where it was a larger bench, 11-judge bench decision, whereby 6-5 majority they said Parliament does not have the power to amend Part 3, the fundamental rights, so as to abridge any of the rights that are guaranteed. So, from unlimited power to amend any part of the Constitution, which was the view the Supreme Court held in the beginning, as long as they have the requisite numbers, to say that they don't have the power to amend the Constitution, Part 3 of the Constitution, so as to abridge. Other parts are fine, but you can't abridge the fundamental. You can amend Part 3 to give a new right, to expand the existing right. To abridge, you don't have the power to amend the Constitution. There are, of course, many technical arguments that are advanced and reasons that were given to justify. I'm not getting into it. And thereafter came, that was a decision in 1967, Golaknath I mentioned, what is known as a very landmark case, Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, where again, an even larger bench sat, 13-judge bench, and overruled Golaknath on the one hand. They said they can amend any part of the Constitution, including Part 3, but the amending power cannot be used to alter or destroy the basic structure of the Constitution of India. What is this basic structure all about? If you compare it to a building, because it talks about structure, it's about what is essential in a building. You know, you have a foundation and pillars, and then walls, and then many other interiors. Basic structure means don't touch the foundation of the pillars. The building has to survive for a longer time, but you can renovate the building. You can beautify it, you can modify, you can upgrade. You can perhaps convert this into a smart house by having what is now called as the Internet of Things. You can do all this, whatever is necessary to upgrade to, update it to the contemporary this thing. but you don't touch the pillars because it will shake the building and perhaps it will risk its existence. The building might collapse. The basic structure is something like that. That there are certain things in the Constitution. You can amend pretty much every part of the Constitution, but there are certain things in the Constitution which is very basic. Its constitutional identity depends on it. And you can't alter or modify those basic structure. Like, can you convert India into a non-democratic country? Democracy is considered to be basic structure.
Right.
Similarly, secularism, rule of law, and judicial review, parliamentary system of government, that was a very conscious choice the framers have made. Parliamentary system of government, Ambedkar explains that, there are two things that we need to focus on. One thing is about stability, whether the government would have. The other thing is about accountability. There is no system which achieves both of them. Presidential system gives you more stability because it doesn't depend on the legislature, majority it survives, but there is less accountability. But the parliamentary system can't give you stability because the government's tenure depends on whether the government has a support of the majority in the lower house of parliament. It can change, but it gives you accountability. There is a collective responsibility. So they say, in making this choice, we preferred accountability over stability. But now that I would say, generally I keep mentioning it everywhere, that this was a very conscious choice. But by inserting 10th schedule, anti-defection law and all that, where MPs' rights have been curtailed to a great extent, I think the very reason as to why framers chose the parliamentary system to ensure greater accountability, which is both daily and periodic in parliamentary system, as Ambedkar pointed out, that it got diluted to a great extent.
And I'm still reflecting on what you just said, which is very interesting, and I sometimes have always felt at times as well, how do you share in a parliament, oh, this is what my constituents want out of me, when it is at odds with what the party wants out of you, because your local, state and national interests, and nothing wrong with any of them, may not be converging in the same way. That is something worth thinking about. And I've always wondered if it would have been great in like lower house or upper house for each and everything that we do. Sometimes we have voice votes, but we have like specifically every member kind of sharing. This is what they stand for, and this is how they're voting, and this is exactly why voting a particular way. So,
yeah, of course, in speeches they can express their views and opinions, but the voting is constrained.
Yeah,
because of the 10th schedule, and now the what is known as a whip is being used for various purposes. One of the reasons as to why 10th schedule was introduced was to give kind of a stability. Earlier, when governments survive on thin or a wafer-thin majority, if two people shift from one block to another, government would collapse. In order to prevent that, they invented and what was known as Ayaram and Gayaram culture. But the point is that I think we have allowed it to operate in a much larger way. That, in my opinion, something like a 10th schedule of binding the representatives to vote in a particular form should have been confined to confidence and no confidence motion, and at the most to money bill, and not beyond that. And now that we have seen whips being issued, even when the parliament takes up some of the other disciplinary matters too, that generally they exercise quasi-judicial power, and the idea of issuing a whip is unknown, but they're increasingly making use of it. As a result, I think MPs hardly have a significant voice, particularly those who are not independent MPs, who belongs to the party fold. All parties issue whips and bind them in several ways, and they're forced to vote, say, in favor of a bill which might adversely affect the people whom they represent. instead of allowing them to represent their constituencies, they can be turned into an agents of a political party. And that's not a good thing. And I always think that 10th schedule needs to be reformed the earliest, and not that you get rid of it, but you restrict, to confidence, no confidence motions and money bill. Other bills, let them convince each member of the parliament that this is good in the interest of the country and good for your constituency, and you vote in favor.
Yeah.
That's very important.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the democratic intents of our polity got significantly reduced after the 10th schedule of the Constitution.
And I was also thinking, when we are thinking People's Constitution as well, and we are thinking about Constitution Day, which we celebrate towards the end of November, and in 26th. Sorry, 26th of November, exactly.
That's the day when Constitution was adopted. And the day when it was brought into force is celebrated as a Republic Day.
Correct. So in 1949, we are doing that.
50.
And in 26 January. And so in 2024 and 2025 in India, on the day of when we celebrate Constitution Day, there were like massive protests by workers and farmers who are raising their voices, amongst other things, particularly about the new labor laws that are being introduced. Now, I don't want to go into the pros and cons of the laws itself, but I'm just wondering the symbolism behind the Constitution, or rather using the Constitution Day to assert your identity and as a voice of what is fundamentally out there, and using mass mobilization or a protest or in any other way to kind of share their voice, which is again an active part of constitution building in some ways, not in a document form, but like anything that's being introduced as well. So do you think in ways like this, where a Constitution Day is not just being limited to a ceremonial exercise versus being leveraged to something larger, is that something, or is this one of those ways where people in the country are still leveraging a day to kind of still voice their opinion about what becomes part of the Constitution, or what becomes part of how a part of the Constitution is interpreted in laws and policies?
It's very important. And to tell you, the 26th November is being celebrated as a Constitution Day only recently. I think from 2015 or 16 we started. Before that, we used to celebrate it as a National Law Day. It has been renamed as a National Constitution Day. In my opinion, every such occasion gives us an opportunity, number one, to celebrate that every passing year entrenches our Constitution further, deeper and deeper. As I mentioned about Tom's Ginsburg work, 50 plus years means it's getting entrenched. If more and more years passing by, Constitution gets more and more deeply entrenched. That's a good reason to celebrate. At the same time, I think every Constitution Day is also meant for reflecting on where we started, how much progress we have made, and what needs to be done for the future. It also provides an opportunity for critical reflections. Are we going on a right path or not? Are the constitutional assurances given to we the people being delivered? Are we at least on the path of delivering them in the near foreseeable future or not? So that reflection should also take place every year. Let's take stock of what we have done in the last 75 years, or at least in the last 1 year, where we are and what more needs to be done. That should happen. And of course, the people protesting on the day of the Constitution, celebrating on the Constitution Day, I don't think it is something that is wrong. Perhaps that's a day also for reflection. And if there are voices saying that constitutional promises are not delivered to us, I think that should be taken into account, and the state should take necessary steps to address the genuine concerns. I have not actually read all the 4 codes so far. I have read about them here and there. I intend to read someday. I can't reflect on what are the good things and what are the bad things.
Yeah.
Did we improve it better than what it was before? All that needs to be very carefully studied. Each branch in law has become so vast. That's we call labor law, and we say it's but Constitution is is the supreme law of the land. Though it doesn't deal with every problem and every aspect of governance, but it provides a framework and a language to address all these problems and all these aspects. And that's where every law should be viewed from the prism of Constitution, because every law is accepted to be in conformity with the Constitution. What we need to, as a constitutional lawyer, I've also taught criminal law for some time in the Indian Law Institute. I used to tell in the classroom that I would look at the criminal law from the constitutional point of view. My focus is on whether the law is in conformity with the Constitution.
Right.
So if I read the labor laws, the new labor codes, my approach is to understand whether these new labor codes would further the constitutional ideals or not. So that's what we need to think about more. So people protesting or raising the concerns or demands on the Constitution Day, I think is very much apt.
And you were just talking about how we are looking at laws from a prism of Constitution, and you said that's the first thing I'll do. And so I'm thinking about, for example, gig workers. Projected to be 2.35 crore or even more so gig workers in the economy. Of course, we have had a fairly large informal economy. Primarily female labor force is in the informal economy. Now, just thinking about the gig workers themselves, and if I'm not wrong, and please correct me, under Article 21, I guess, we are talking about the constitutional protection for labor that's happening. And now, of course, gig work in its current form didn't exist when the Constitution was framed, right? But today, when gig work is so prominent, a lot of workers are picking it up as a means to earn. What kind of reimagining is needed within the Constitution, if any, or do you think the framework already exists, like you were saying, but we need to focus more on the protection for the labor workforce, which is evolving in this day and age under Section 21? So where do you think this fits if we look at it from a lens of gig work?
I think I would go with your latter suggestion. So, Constitution is a fundamental law of the land. It can't deal with every aspect and every problems. Otherwise, we would have only one law called the Constitution and nothing else. But being a fundamental law of the land, as I said before, it provides a framework and also a language to address all these kinds of problems. You particularly mentioned about Article 21, which talks about right to life and personal liberty, protection of right to life and personal liberty. And our Supreme Court over the period of time said right to life means right to live with dignity.
And the key word is dignity.
Dignity. Right to live with dignity. It's there in preamble also. The key word dignity is there in the preamble of the Constitution, which is a guiding light for interpretation of the Constitution. So, right to live with dignity is available to every person, even to a non-citizen under the Indian Constitution. Article 21 is not just confined to citizens. So, irrespective of whatever the field a person is in, he has a right to be treated with dignity. And now recently in one of the cases, Supreme Court has said that this right to life and personal liberty also has horizontal application, in the sense it's not just enforceable against the state, even against others too. And the state has a positive obligation to promote it. So it is for the state to enact suitable legislations to provide safeguards for workers in the informal sector, including the gig work. And they were earlier called, executives. Now they have even more fantastic word called delivery partners or something. The partners who don't sit in board meetings. That's the important issue, that we don't have enough protection. But if you want to make the constitutional promises a living reality, I think there is a need to enact legislations to provide social security and other protections, and also regulate the exploitative working conditions that are there, to provide minimum safeguards, breaks, leaves with pay, all those things. This kind of statutory protection needs to be provided. There is no need to amend the Constitution, because constitutional rights are the non-negotiable minimum safeguards which are given to every individual. It doesn't deal with the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
It doesn't prevent the state from giving further protection.
Yeah.
Rather, it requires the state. There is this directive principles of state policy, which also talks about some of the labor rights. Professor Upendra Bakshi, one of the renowned professors in law, says that if the entire directive principles is to be summed up in one line, it requires policies that disproportionately benefits the worst off in the society. That's what the directive principles are. You make policies that would disproportionately benefit the worst off in the society. The gig workers, or even domestic workers, and workers in the informal sector, construction sector, and many others. So they need the state protection. And the Constitution, in a way, tells the state you should do all of it. And it's the state action that is required. We don't need to change the Constitution for everything. I would even say sometimes, even Article 21A insertion and right to education is not mandatory. The moment you think of giving certain right, it doesn't mean that you have to convert them into a fundamental right first. The state is fully empowered, rather required under the Constitution, to give free and fair education for all children between 6 to 4. That was part of the directive principles of state policy. The moment you think of implementing the DPSP, directive principles, you don't have to convert it into a fundamental right through an amendment. Particularly the diluted form in which it was inserted into Article 21A of the Constitution was not required. You simply enact a law straight away. Right to Education Act could have been directly enacted without Article 21A. Not that the Parliament did not have a legislative competence to do so. They could have enacted it and then implemented it. So it is the state action, more particularly instead of a loose policy statements or something, legislations which are more firm, to provide these kind of protections to gig workers and workers in other informal sectors, who are leading their life in a very difficult conditions, sometimes risking their life in the process. Is one of the important concerns that needs to be addressed at the earliest.
And I think the gig work and like the new laws that are being introduced, the economically weaker section, reservation, UCC bills, and so many millions of other things, all of them talk about this negotiation, the constant negotiation between equality, the legal uniformity, and a life of dignity. But I think something you said is also how in the directive principles of state policy itself, what was so deeply enshrined is that you're working for the worse off way more, and that's where a bulk of our focus should lie as well. And then with this new conversation around duties versus rights, where they should be enshrined itself, and I think some of these constant negotiations will always be there, I guess, which is part of a healthy democracy at times. But who gets a voice and a seat at the table equally, or who has a louder voice or the seat at the table itself, is also talks about the negotiation as well.
True. Of course, it's constant negotiations that happen to demand from the state what is required. Sometimes it happens with the intervention of the courts. People increasingly go through the courts to demand from the state what is required to be done. But as you have rightly pointed out, not everyone has equal access. Of course, there are fundamental rights which are equally available to everyone. But in case of their denial, it's only the High Court and the Supreme Court which are empowered to enforce them. And not everyone is in a position to, whenever there are violations of their rights, to approach these courts to seek remedies through the courts of law. And access to justice is one of the important concerns. And that remain a concern, notwithstanding some efforts in the form of Legal Services Authorities Act that is enacted. And then this expansion of the concept of locus standi, or dilution of the concept of locus standi, and then invention of what is called public interest litigations, where it's not necessary that a poor man who's affected should approach the court. Anyone on his or her behalf can approach the court and seek remedies, and public-spirited individuals. And of course, in 1980s and 90s, there was this thing called epistolary jurisdiction, where one could write a letter to the judges. I don't know whether that's still happening now. There are, of course, provisions which talks about it when letter is received, how they should put in the Supreme Court rules. But that's when the Supreme Court said, you don't have to have this pedantic approach when it comes to enforcement of fundamental right, that someone must come, formally file a petition with a wakalat in a particular format, with all these. Even a letter would be sufficient for the court to intervene. And then courts have also started taking what is called suo motu cognizance of the matter. If they come to know about any glaring violations of the rights, court said, we don't need anyone to approach us. We can't be silent observers of injustices that are perpetuated. We can act on our own. And then this suo motu jurisdiction, all that has democratized to a great extent the judicial approach. But still, there are many things that go unnoticed. The media don't highlight all violations. Somehow they focus on important cities and important issues there. We hardly get to read about life in villages. The vast majority of Indians still live in villages. We don't get news from there. What kind of violations? They rarely get reported. Even if reported, they're reported in such regional, local newspapers, with judges who have the suo motu power don't read. They don't even catch the attention of these judges too. I think there is a lot more that needs to be done to ensure access to justice and empower people to negotiate more.
I think we have been talking, and you were referring to preamble just now. And for many citizens of the country here, one of the first ways how they engage with the Constitution in a written format is, as students, when we see preamble in our NCERT textbooks right at the start. And also there are fundamental rights written, fundamental duties written as well. And then over a period of years, the civics or any other chapters come in different points, and we are learning more about the Constitution itself. But of course, Constitution is more than just that. It's a living, breathing document. And it is something meant to be experienced as citizens in a living, breathing manner. So when we think about Constitution and the values it enshrines, the values of equity, the values of justice, and so much more, how do citizens, and particularly I'm here referring to the students, how do students can experience it? How can they engage with it? How can they discuss it? It can be in terms of how they're discussing it in their textbooks, how they are engaging with it when they go out there and doing any exercises, or maybe there are other ways, so that they truly understand the spirit, but also help in making it a living, breathing, active document which they contribute to citizens in the future as well?
Generally, constitutional scholars say that it is an instrument. It is not an instrument for the government to control the people. It is an instrument. Constitution is an instrument for the people to control the government. It is an empowering document. It empowers people. People can demand accountability from the state. It is important for everyone to have at least the basic idea of what the Constitution is all about. I'm happy that increasingly it is being incorporated into school curriculums. I come from the state of Karnataka, where I was doing law or masters. That was the time when Constitution was made mandatory for all disciplines. In some form, engineering, medicine, architects, or even social sciences, science students. Constitution was one of the subjects to be taught. That's such a important decision. If the Constitution has to become a living reality, constitutional values, goals, morals, to become living reality, it is first and foremost very important to create awareness about the Constitution. And the best way is to start in the schools. That's the way to cultivate constitutional values too. And that's the way to convert constitutional morality into a living reality. First and foremost, you make them understand what it is about and how important it is, how significant it is in the context of the history, where we started from, at what moment we agreed to this. Constitution reflects the national consensus, and that is what the nation has agreed to, and that shows a particular path, and that path is to be tread. That we should go on such a path, and it is important for everyone to know about the Constitution. Increasingly, I see preamble reading has been made mandatory in some of the states, and many people have started reading preamble. Preamble is no doubt, is a constitution in a nutshell. Everything is in the Constitution is in the preamble in a nutshell. But to understand what is the significance of it, the preamble, you will have to read the entire Constitution to understand its true meaning, purport of the promises that are made in the preamble of the Constitution. So people should be encouraged to learn about it in schools. They should be made aware, and I think we need to go beyond the preamble as well. We need to read at least minimally the fundamental rights that are available, the directive, because they tell you what rights you have, and which is also limitations on the state power as to what the state can't do to you. And the directive principles of state policy, to understand what we can reasonably expect from the state. Because the state is expected to implement the directive principles of state policy, though we say they're judicially non-enforceable. They tell you what you can reasonably expect from the state, and the state should deliver to you. And they should read the directive principles of state policy, and at the same time they should also read fundamental duties. Though they were inserted during the emergency era, the fundamental duties are very laudable. The citizens must adhere to the fundamental duties that are conferred. So I wish more and more people read not just the preamble, but also Part 3, Part 4, and the Part 4A of the Constitution. Rest of it is also administrative details. If you want to understand the structure of government, you want to understand how it operates, how power is organized in many ways. One can look at the other parts of the Constitution, the checks and balances that exist in the Constitution, all that's important. But I would say minimally, at least, there should be greater awareness about the rights, the directive principles, as well as the fundamental duties in the Constitution.
No, I think that makes sense. I taught in an all-girls convent school here in New Delhi in Sangam here, and I taught a classroom of 97 students. And these were 97 seventh graders. And I think there was this civic chapter where we were learning about elections. And so they were reading it, right? But like you said, I think it's very important to experience it, to discuss it and everything. So one of the things we did was, just luckily at that time, local consular elections were going on at that time. And so I requested the students, why don't you just go out and check in your constituency, in your area, who all are standing? Just, and are they affiliated to any parties or they're independent? They went out there and created a list. I was like, okay, now once you have the list, why don't you go and check what kind of election manifesto have they put out there? What are the things they're promising? So they went out there and they did all of that work. They came back. And while we were also like developing, apart from civics, we were also developing skills like how to do research, how to ask good questions. So we were like, okay, now look at that. Parallelly, we have previously done an exercise where what are the key things that matter to them as a citizen? And we had looked at fundamental rights and other things. So as children or girl citizens in the country, 13 to 14 years old, living in this low-income community, what are the key things that they would want out of a government, right? So then the exercise was, okay, let's map what are they promising in election manifesto and what you have wanted and where they're intersecting. The next exercise was, okay, we have learned how to ask good questions. So let's create a series of questions or interviews and also identify when are they holding rallies, when are they coming near your doorsteps or where their offices are. And then, so long story short, eventually they ended up going and asking some of these questions to some of the consulars that were standing at that time, which was very annoying for the consulars as well because they were not expecting some of these questions. And we had a huge exercise. But I think as an outcome for one of this exercise, it was about, okay, how do you really experience elections? How does someone who doesn't vote? And their reflections were like, oh, they don't care about us because we don't even vote. Our parents are saying, oh, don't shout, don't ask questions in this larger rally and all of that. Some parents are also encouraging, but they also had other reflections like, where do we have a voice in the kind of policies and the kind of thing that are being made for us? No one asks us. And of course, yes, oh, you are just children, etc., etc. But we can have an opinion in what there is. And there were other reflections. I still remember that I met one of the consular afterwards, and this is now 6 months later, and they're like, and I was just introducing myself, and they suddenly had this very angry face, and they're like, oh, you are the teacher who sent those students. Afterwards, they were joking around with that. It was so embarrassing. They asked me certain questions I couldn't.
They're messing up with the prospective voters.
Yeah, and they're like, oh, it wasn't that good of a reaction for me. Funnily, he was. He was that whole concept, and I think that has been popularized by the series Panchayat, which is the Panchpati, but talking about urban area, he is the one who is holding the power versus the women who is getting the reserved seat. She's there, she's the one running, but things like that. Anyway, I think it made me really think about time and again how when you really think about engaging and really going deep into making something very tangible, making something a lived experience so that you can really engage with something versus something which just feels like such an alien or such a alien work or such an alien piece of exercise which you can't engage with. But that should be an everyday reality as well in many ways.
True. And people can experience the Constitution in working in several ways. It's just that they don't know, they're not aware.
Yeah.
When you walk into a restaurant and they serve you food without asking for your social identity, it's the Constitution that is working. So it has given you several rights, and at least gradually discriminations in public places is not so evident as it used to be. There were times when people were not allowed to dine together. They're not allowed to travel together. They're not allowed to move together. These are no longer an issue. And it's the Constitution is working. And perhaps if they're told to observe, if they first of all, if they have the knowledge of what Constitution promises, and then observe how much is the reality now, probably they would see more and more. They experience Constitution more and more. They should become more conscious observers.
Yeah, and like you
of
rightly
what they see around.
100%, and like you rightly pointed out earlier as well, like it's a constant exercise.
Yeah.
So the discrimination is going lower, but we haven't eradicated it.
We haven't eradicated it, but it's not that nothing has been done so far.
Yeah.
It's not the case.
Yeah.
A lot of transformations that have taken place, and many of the public places now, social identities don't matter as much as it used to. There is drastic changes that you see today. Nobody would prevent anybody from drinking from the public tap. It was not the case before the Constitution, or immediately after that. It did not trickle down. Now, it took some time, and some of the obvious things are disappearing gradually. Some say they've not gone away, they've gone underground, they operate from there. Now that focus should be on ensuring that they disappear from the underground as well. But at least on the surface, you see changes, and that's the way to begin with. You can't, that centuries old prejudices cannot be eradicated so easily. It will take time, but it is, having its impact.
Yeah, and I think what you said now, many things going underground is so important, which comes, for example, when someone is going out to rent. Who is getting discriminated, not so obviously in the face, but who is less likely to get a space.
There is Constitution doesn't go to to interfere with directly the private space. It says shops open this thing, guards and this thing. There shall be no they should be open to all sections, and temples there should be entry. But suppose if you own a house. Whom do you rent it out? Can you, even if you directly say, I don't rent it out to you because you belong to a particular religion, I don't want to have you in my house, or you belong to a particular caste, I don't think Constitution there can come in the way.
Right.
Because, and with this, so it's your private choice. You say, I don't want to rent out my house to a non-vegetarian. It's your private choice. But if they follow their fundamental duties, they will have to. It requires that you should preserve the composite culture. You should respect the diversities in the society. I think, but now it is not as much as it used to be earlier. These things mattered a lot. Now many of them look for a person who's reliable, think that they would pay the rent regularly. But it's not the case everywhere. There are no doubt discrimination that happens. But Constitution doesn't go there in private choice. But if you believe in the constitutional ideals and the values, then it is for you to imbibe those values in your private life as well.
Which is also interesting. Like, of course, the Constitution is not interfering in private life. And so if something has to be completely rooted out, it's a lot more mindset. It's a lot more, as a society, what we think is most important, and where the laws kind of come into the fore, where the policies come into fore as well. I think something you talked about is observing, right? What are some of the ways how citizens can observe and engage with Constitution in everyday life, which may not be so obvious?
That in the sense, you must be attentive. To notice, one should observe oneself too. Sometimes we make comments unintended but offending, which the Constitution says don't do. In the say anything that is derogatory to the dignity of the woman, we should restrain ourselves from saying or doing things that are derogatory to the dignity of women. We should sometimes unconsciously we keep forwarding even jokes about. So if you observe yourself, you understand, and that's where the transformation takes place. Kind of words which we were using, taken for granted as something that is acceptable and usable, you become more and more conscious about it. So first, you inculcate the constitutional values yourself,
Yeah.
and then reflect on others too,
Yeah.
and try and contribute in whatever possible way to point out what is constitutionally right and what is constitutionally wrong. Constitutional morality for me is about using constitution as a basis to decide what is right and what is wrong.
And I was just wondering, if you were a member of parliament right now, you're sitting in Lok Sabha, and you have the power to bring, not necessarily passed, which is a whole different thing, but if you have a power to introduce any law or act or anything along those lines, is there anything that you feel like that, I would like to introduce this?
I don't know, something what I like, one has to be more than a member of a Lok Sabha. They hardly have any power, as I mentioned to you. And that with all. And the private member bills are not likely to succeed in India. There are very few private member bills. I don't know, I have not come across with any studies, but whatever private member bills I have seen being introduced, they've never seen the light of the day. But there are many things that needs to be done. I would say from the constitutional point of view, if you ask me the only one thing that I should suggest, I would propose a bill to empower the district judiciary to enforce fundamental rights. Not just the High Courts and the Supreme Court, which constitutionally empowered. Article 32, Class 3 already contemplates, it has empowered the Parliament to empower the subordinate judiciary to implement fundamental rights. If you say, to enable more and more people to exercise their right in case of their violations, they should be allowed to approach even the lowest court to seek enforcement of fundamental rights. And the Constitution has already contemplated it. It is not that you have to amend the Constitution for the purpose. All that needs to be done is to enact a law to empower at least the district judiciary to issue writs, orders or direction for enforcement of fundamental rights, at least against the executive actions. Because most of the violations of rights involve state executive actions. And if the remedy is accessible, I think more and more people would use the Constitution as to assert their rights and resist the state actions which they consider as violative of their fundamental rights. That is one thing that I would want to do. But of course, I have a lot of other things for which I don't think even if I become an MP, I would be able to do it. One should become something more than that.
But I think advocacy is still an important aspect of us playing a role as citizens and saying, and having a discourse about that as well. I think we're coming towards the close of the episode. So one of the things that I really want to ask you, and this is for our listeners, if you have to recommend, could you recommend us 3 books to read, 2 things to watch or listen, and 1 person to follow? So what would you recommend?
Very tall order. I would say Constitution, there is far too much literature on the Constitution. To pick one is very, very
You can recommend any 3 things to read.
I would say, like, number one, I am someone who insist on reading the original. I would say read the Constitution by text first, at least till part 4A, if not the entire Constitution, if you do not want to go into the technicalities. 2, read the speech by Ambedkar. I'll put all of them into one, Constituent Assembly. 1, the Nehru's speech at the time of moving objective resolution. Ambedkar's speech at the time of moving the draft constitution, that is 4th of November 1948 or so. And again, Ambedkar's last speech on 25th of November 1949 to get an idea of the constitution and what were the apprehensions the framers have had. and all that. That is the second thing. And then the third, there are many new books that have come up. I would say read at least any one. I would say give the list and choose the one you are interested in. Of course, Rohit Day's People's Constitution, as well as the Assembling India's Constitution are good. It reflects on the common man's engagement with the Constitution.
Right.
If the focus is on that, I think they're the books to read.
Yeah.
And then there is also this. There are many others, of course. I can go on, but I will
of
end
course.
there. And I would urge people to watch this Doordarshan serial, if you remember, Samvidhan by Shyam Benegal. There's 10 or 12 episode series that it is available on YouTube. Of course, it's not possible for everyone to think of even reading the Constituent Assembly debates. There are 12 volumes, 5 different books bound, very extensive. But you will get glimpses of it in that. And then if you are sufficiently interested, then you can go to the Constituent Assembly debates. But watch that Samvidhan series. I don't have a second thing which I can recommend that you should watch. One person to follow, again, that's a very difficult thing. I would say it is better to suggest one institution to follow.
Okay.
And that's the Supreme Court. It's widely reported. And the Supreme Court is the place where the life of the Constitution unfolds. And you would know what's happening in reality. And now that there are many platforms like Bar and Bench, Live Law, and even regular newspapers pretty much cover every important thing that happens in the Supreme Court in order to keep track of what is happening with our Constitution, what's happening with our rights. That's an institution to follow. Otherwise, if at all, if you want me to recommend one person, I think Gautam Bhatia, you may have heard of, he has his blog and he keeps writing regularly, is one. And there are many, of course, that one can follow. So there are a lot of scholars now who are working on Constitution. Like I would now say, perhaps in the last one and a half decade, many books were written than in the previous 60 years on Constitution. So there's a lot to read.
Of course. It's endless. And of course, to follow you as well and all the articles and the work that you're doing and a couple of exciting
things. Of course,
I
did not mention that, because I'm party to it. There is this Indian Law Institute, my earlier institute. It publishes what is called an annual survey of Indian law. And it has several subjects in law. But what annual survey actually does is to examine all the developments that has taken place in a particular field of law in a calendar year from January 1st to December 31st.
Right.
Say, in Constitution, what are the important cases that have come to the court? Was there any amendment to the Constitution in that year? And how? And then we discuss that amendment, and then the cases. What was the important law laid down? New interpretation. What are the issues that came up? We discuss, and we'll see whether they are consistent with the previous decisions. Have the court deviated from it, and all that we have analyzed, and then we write that every year. And Constitution is such a huge subject that it's been split into two parts. Constitution 1 and Constitution 2. I write one part of it, particularly on fundamental rights, every year. If you want to know how the fundamental rights jurisprudence is evolving, Annual Survey of Indian Law is one thing to go for. And there is Constitution 2 too. So, like if you follow any other branch of law, like environment, like criminal law or something, there are different chapters written by different scholars. So, of course, you will not be able to read all that, but whatever branch of law you're interested in, if it is Constitution, then reading these two surveys would give you an idea of how Constitution has evolved over the last year. Right. Now, beginning now, I'm writing 2025. So that's also another thing that one can read to keep oneself abreast with the changes. That's the Constitution is as you mentioned several times, is a living law. It's a living document. In constitutional interpretation too, there are two theories: originalism and living constitutional theory. Originalism talks about the original meaning of the text and the original intent of the Constitution. That's what the courts should be implementing. But the living constitutional theory is different. It says the Constitution text has a life of its own. It grows out of context. When, say, for example, look at untouchability. It came from a particular context of a caste-based practice of untouchability. But in the Sabarimala case, the Supreme Court used it even while dealing with the issue of women's entry into the temple. It says untouchability is abolished. And the Supreme Court says any discrimination or the exclusion based on the concept of purity and pollution is untouchability. If you look at historically, the reason was different, but it doesn't define untouchability as such. It says untouchability in any form is abolished. So the court said this is also a practice of untouchability. So you, as and when you see the text of the Constitution has a life of its own, it grows. There is this also empty vessel theory in constitutional interpretation. It says that constitutional provisions or principles are like empty vessels. What is life? It had a quite different meaning over a period of time. Now the court say it is the right to live with dignity. What is dignity? These are not just words, they are concepts. They evolve much faster. And they say these constitutional principles are like empty vessels. Each generation, based on their experience, must pour content into it. The language of Constitution is more abstract. Aaron Barak says in one of his books that why the language of the Constitution is more abstract. He says constitutions generally reflect national consensus, and such consensus can be built at some level of abstraction. If you get into too much of specifics, it's difficult to build consensus. So this abstract language gives more scope for the judiciary to keep the Constitution abreast with the time without waiting for legislature to amend or change depending on the needs of the hour. They say same set of provisions now mean different things.
100%.
So it's important to understand the constitutional law. It's important to understand how courts interpret the Constitution too.
And which also makes us go back to the fundamental principles, the fundamental rights, the fundamental values that we hold really true, which may also need to evolve with time, but at least at the end of the day, which is a really good note. And I would love to invite you to read your postcard. I know you wrote a postcard to your future self. I don't know which year you picked, so would love to know that. But if you can read it out, I think that would be brilliant.
Yes, I jotted down a few things. The year I picked is 2049.
Okay.
And that's the year when Constitution is going to complete 100 years, 26th of November, 2049.
Right.
And it goes something like this. Dear Puneet, hope you are doing well and more happier now. We have not had a conversation for a very long time. Last time when we had conversations about the Constitution, uncertainties were looming large. We had discussion on the eve of 75th year of the adoption of the Constitution. Our concern then was that even after 75 years, the constitutional morality has not yet become a natural sentiment in the country. We had failed to cultivate it. We are also worried that our economic policies are not in conformity with the constitutional principles. Instead of reducing inequalities in income and wealth, our policies are increasing them. We are moving in an opposite direction than the one mandated by the Constitution. Now that our Constitution is more entrenched, it withstood some storms and survived. All uncertainties are settled now, more or less. People have realized that Constitution is their instrument to control the government and not the other way around. Constitutional morality is fast becoming a natural sentiment. Our school curriculums have helped in cultivating constitutional values. India has become much more coherent now. We celebrate our diversities and respect our composite culture. Hope we continue to stay on the same path and ensure no one is left behind. Wishing you a happy Constitution Day and happier days in our democratic republic. Yours.
That's beautiful. And it's so apt that you put 1949
1949.
at the center. I'm hearing a lot of hope in your words as well for what lies in the future. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Puneet. It has been such a fabulous, fabulous conversation. I think we learned so much. And I am also talking about the team behind the scenes who were shooting as well. Like they also expressed, I think it has been such an interesting conversation around all things Constitution. One of the things we are taking away is the fact that Constitution is not what is shared by the courts, but it's also what the citizens can access, can contest, and can reclaim in their everyday lives, which makes it truly living and breathing as a document as well. But we are really grateful for all the time and energy and insights that you shared with us.
Thank you for having me on your show. It is in fact my first podcast.
Okay.
I did it long time back with a school kid on a Republic Day Eve, which was a very short one, but in fact this is the very first one. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for all those interesting questions. It also made me to reflect on some of the things that I talked about today. I thank you and your whole team for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we kind of sign off, I'm reminded of these words by Dr. Ambedkar. Constitution is not a mere lawyer's document. It is a vehicle of life, and its spirit is always the spirit of age. We're really grateful to all of you for joining us today and listening or watching this beautiful episode. Your thoughts and your reflections are really welcome. So please drop them in the comments. Please like, share, and subscribe in whatever way you can. Even if you don't agree to some of the conversations that are discussed, to some of the things that we mentioned, that's the whole point. If Constitution has taught us anything, if the Constitution making has taught us anything, it's the debate, it's the discourse. That is the most crucial thing. As Postcards, we are a community, so we are welcome to join our Postcards community. The link is out there in our show notes. We do a lot of activities and events. Please do join us for one of those spaces as well. We would love to have you and host you as well. Before I sign off, it would be remiss and it won't be right of me to give a huge shout out to the brilliant team who has tirelessly worked behind the scenes for this episode, making it really possible. So first of all, to Natasha, who was truly a brainchild behind this episode. She not only researched this episode, but asked a lot of important questions. And as a lawyer herself, I think she really felt passionately about it. And I also want to give a huge shout out to both Anika and Simran, who have not just worked behind the scenes to make sure the production goes well, but has also contributed to the larger making of this episode in more ways than one. And finally, a huge shout out to our speaker and for all their insights. We're really, really grateful to have them. This is your host, Nikun, signing off, and see you next time.